Since there's not going to be another session before Pesach, I'm using the liberty of invoking the dictum of the Talmud that 30 days before Passover, there's so much to learn about Passover, you should starting already a month in advance. So I'm going to say a couple things about Passover, but really, Passover, I believe, is about Haggadah. The Haggadah is stories. Even though the Judaism really lives on the legal parts of the Torah, and there's plenty of that about Passover and the amounts of things you eat, and this year it's on Shabbos and how much more we eat and all that. But the story part of the Haggadah is really what is the generation passes one to the next. I'm always struck by the fact that if you look from grandparent to grandchild, assume it's about 50, 60, 70 years between a grandchild old enough to understand and a grandparent young enough to be understood, right, at the same Seder. It's not 3,000 years since we've had Passover Seders. If you look at it that way, we've had about 40 Seders. That means when the grandparent at this year's Seder was many years ago the 10-year-old child who was listening to their grandparent and so on, you only go back about 40 Seders and you're back to the Jews who left Egypt. It's a very compact time. I'm going to tell you a few stories about Pesach. I wrote about, in case you're distracted, I wrote about it this week for the bulletin. And I wanted to talk about kind of the Jewish people, and I'm talking about 4 different people in the Jewish people. I grew up in Baltimore, but I lived for 12 years in Seattle. When I was there, when a young man named Howard Schultz started a coffee. Why is Starbucks so successful? It's because he was smart enough to start in Seattle, which was always overcast, and people were really exhausted at about 2 in the afternoon. So he put high-octane caffeine-laden coffee, and everybody was just drinking it by the buckets. Howard Schultz went to Israel, and he wrote about it in the New York Times, and in his recent book, From the Ground Up, he wrote about his encounter with the head of the yeshiva, the dean of the yeshiva in the Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem. Famous story, all these American businessmen and walk into the Mir Yeshiva. Rabbi Finkel at that time had Parkinson's. He couldn't control his muscles that well. He couldn't speak that well. And he slams on the table and he says, "Gentlemen, listen to me. What was the lesson of the Holocaust?" And they all go through their answers. He says, "To me, the lesson of the Holocaust is based on a story in the Gemara which says, sometimes many people can share one blanket and all be warm. And sometimes the opposite is true. Everyone could have what they need and they're way apart. How is it possible for one blanket to warm 7 people?" So he says during the Holocaust, he heard the story that there were people in the concentration camp all packed in like sardines in the bed. And they only had one blanket. So what did they do? They would start with the blanket on one person, and they would pass it to the next person, who would pass it to the next person, and so on. And then it would go back and forth all night. And everyone got a little bit of warmth and shared their blanket. And he says, "You people have blankets. You need to go back to the United States and share them with others." That is my message to you. And Howard Schultz says in his book, you read it now, it's a New York Times bestseller. He's going to be most likely next week declaring his bid for the presidency. He was inspired by that transformative meeting of this very, very powerful individual, the teacher, some of the people in this room. That's story number 1, sharing the blanket. The illustration of this, which is my favorite story I heard this past week, and we lost a great rabbi, the Skulena Rebbe, who lived in Borough Park, 100,000 people, and a couple of cops who got hit by a thing and things at the funeral. It was an amazing event, overwhelming. He and his father lived in Romania. Soviet, at that time, ruled Romania in late 1950s. And they found enough flour to bake matzahs in the house. And they spread word around quietly. Anyone who's, still able to and interested in Passover, you can get one matzah. They baked a few dozen matzahs. And everyone came quietly and they got their matzahs. The son of the Vizhnitzer Rebbe comes to the school and Rebbe and he says, my father says we must have 2 matzahs, not 1. You know, people are very strict about how much matzah you eat on Passover. And Rabbi Portugal didn't know what to do, and he talks to his father, and he said, yeah. So begrudgingly he gave him the 2 matzahs. And everyone else he gave 1 matzah, 1 matzah, 1 matzah. And finally they ran out of matzahs. And that was it. The day before Passover, the Vizhnitzer Rebbe's son comes back and says, Rabbi Portugal, he says, I'm sorry, I have no more matzahs left. He says, no. Did you keep any matzahs for yourself? He says, no, I couldn't see someone not have, I gave away my last matzah that I had for myself. He says, yeah, my father said you would do that. That's why he asked for the 2 matzahs. So he made me bring back the second matzah because he knew you wouldn't keep any for yourself. So here's the matzah back for you to have matzah on Seder night. It says, have a Chag Kasher Zmeach. That was from Rabbi Eisenbach's WhatsApp group. And I thought of the same message, the way, the concern for the other is really the message on Pesach. The third story was with Mayor Anshel Rothschild was the last one that really hit home. The Rothschilds were very wealthy. He's there with his young son, and they go to the fruit store and they buy a bag of 3 apples. A poor person approaches him on the street and says, can you have any food? I'm hungry, I'm starving. So he takes out an apple and gives him the apple. And so Mayor Anshel looks at his son and he says, how many apples do we have left? 10-year-old kid, he says, 2. He says, incorrect. He says, we have 1 apple left. He says, and he looks in the bag, he says, there's 2 apples left. He says, no, we have 1 apple left. Let me explain. The 2 apples in the bag, you and I will eat very soon and they'll be gone. And after that, all we'll have left is the reward that we had for giving 1 apple to the poor person who was hungry. And in that way, my son, you understand, we really only keep the 1 apple after the 3 apples are gone. The apples that we ate are merely apples that are here and they are gone. But that 1 apple we keep. And I'm glad that wasn't explosive. The message that he was trying to give his sons that we really only keep something when we share it with others. And that's the message of the story with Howard Schultz, with Reb Nosson Tzvi Finkel, and the School Leonard Rebbe, and the Vizhnitzer Rebbe, and Mayor Anshel Rothschild with his son. All of them were about the idea, really, I think the message of Pesach is, the Rambam's really his message. He says, you think a holiday is a holiday, it's so holy and wonderful? If we have all the foods and everything that are delicacies and wonderful and the most kosher things in the world, but we only have ourselves, then it's not a simcha for God, it's a simcha for our stomach. But if you have other people, especially people who don't have a place to go, and don't have money to make their own place, if you have them over for Passover or for a holiday, then it's a really holiday for God, not just our stomach. So we can contribute to the money for people who need things for Passover, or better yet, or also have people over for ourselves as guests on Passover. We're not giving, we're getting, we're receiving when we open our homes to others. And I think that's why so much of the Passover Seder is opening the door for guests. We start off, even if we might have missed the opportunity, maybe there's someone late, they need a place to have. It's always been an underpinning of Pesach that we have guests all the way from the beginning, all the way through the end with Eliyahu and Navi, ultimately the guests. And through these mitzvahs, we'll hopefully have the Chag Kasher V'Sameach, the Passover that really is meaningful, where we pass over to the generation. You know, the worst word, my friend who's a psychiatrist said, the worst word ever created in the 21st century selfie. Selfie. It used to be photography was a euphy. Now it's a selfie. Even photographs we made about me, I. Right? Selfie. He says it's the most narcissistic, disorders he's ever seen in the last 20 years because of the self-centeredness of this generation is becoming unbelievably difficult to deal with just for human relations. So with that, we should make our Pesach a Yufi, where it's we don't need selfies on Pesach. We can make a Yufi. And that's where we should know that Judaism is really about sharing the blanket with others and keeping the matzah and giving it back to the person who didn't have one. And maybe we realize that all we really have left at the end is the one apple that we gave to the other person to share it with them. With that, I ask you a Chag Kasher V'Sameach.